Name is Drew Clark. I am the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and we are very excited to welcome you to another episode of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We have moved from Zoom meetings to Zoom webinars, so there's been just a few technical changes because of that. The main reason for it was we were having more than 100 live attendees, and we couldn't accommodate that for meetings, so we moved over to webinars. The only difference, because I have enabled chat, is that we hope you will put your questions into the question and answer bar instead of the tab bar. That way you can upvote and downvote questions. And we also, are live streaming, as we always do, to other platforms, Twitter or X, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We are still waiting for one of our panelists to join us in the room, but we know he's out there, and look forward to showcasing that when he does. But while we're waiting, and before we get into this very active topic of net neutrality, a breaking news topic, I want to just mention that we have just come off last week, less than a week ago, the BEAD Implementation Summit that we Broadband Breakfast hosted at Clydes of Gallery Place. We had the deputy, or really the director, not the deputy, the director of the BEAD program at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And those of you who attended in person or via webcast will be able to access the recordings, the high quality recordings from that event. And if you missed it, you can still sign up Breakfast Club members, which is our premium product, for $99 a month. You can access all of our content, but for just $35 a month, we have launched the BEAD Starter Pack, which enables you to watch all of the content from that event, as well as the 3 exclusive reports we prepared ahead of time. As always, we cover broadband infrastructure, but we also cover broadband's impact, adoption and usage, issues like net neutrality and privacy. These are things that are part of the wheelhouse that we consider and cover and take expert opinions on. So if you've got a really strong opinion that you like to share and have brought before all of the many readers of Broadband Breakfast, we'd be happy to consider that. And speaking of which, I want to give a huge shout out to the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast programming. If we did not have the support of our sponsors, we would not be able to do this free programming that we do every Wednesday through Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Our sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, DCS Technologies, Nokia, Broadband Toolkit, the Comlog Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, Bitstream Communications, and Positron Access. Thank you to our sponsors for your support. And I also just wanted to mention that as part of the programming we do, we have been we've got a great lineup for coming weeks in the future. Next week, we're going to be talking about a really important topic to a lot of people in this community, permitting reforms and pole attachments and the interaction of those issues. The week following, we'll be doing the Affordable Connectivity Program, should it be renewed or will it be renewed? And I also should say, I meant to say this a little bit earlier, bookmark this time and this place on Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We will be doing a program every Wednesday, unless there's some crazy circumstance, at 12 noon Eastern time. And we encourage you to bookmark this page so that you can attend. But the one thing you've got to be prepared for is that sometimes we change the programming, right? So we were looking forward to the discussion about the Affordable Connectivity Program. We will come back to it in a fortnight, but with the news yesterday, the FCC is moving forward on net neutrality. We said we got to do something live. We got to bring together our community the way we always do, and hear different points of view. And you will hear different points of view today. So that's just a kind of a reminder that the page that showcases our upcoming events is constantly changing. After net neutrality, permitting, affordable connectivity program, we'll talk about spectrum sharing on October 18th, and then more topics are on the agenda there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our panel. We are, again, like I said, looking for our fifth or first, technically, panelist. But let's roll forward with who we've got here on the program. We're going to give each of our panelists 3 to 4 minutes to give an introduction. Obviously, the news of the day, the news of the moment is that net neutrality is rolling forward. We actually, for this event, we put together, and we do for most of our events, this page we call panelist resources. So the live stream or the archive of this video will be available at the link I just put in the chat. And on that page, you can see links to several articles. We actually did a piece 2.5 years ago saying that, on the cusp of sea change, we were examining net neutrality debate, thinking that there would be a new change in the policy on net neutrality 2.5 years ago. It just took that long to get 5 commissioners at the FCC. Now that there is a 5th commissioner, Ana Gomez, sworn in just 2 days ago, I think less than 48 hours ago, Jessica Rosenworcel, the chairwoman of the FCC, has wasted no time in putting forth a proposal, which we'll hear about now, to go back to the Title II regulation that net neutrality was put under. So we're going to hear our panelists' take on the topic. Let me introduce the panelists that we've got. I will introduce Chip Pickering, using my faith that he will find his way to this link. Chip is the CEO of Encompass. We are very excited to have him on the program as the CEO of Encompass. He's been at the forefront of every major telecommunications milestone, from his time as a Senate staffer until his role as a member of Congress leading tech issues, to his role now as CEO of the leading Internet and Competitive Networks Association. We'll hear from here as soon as he joins. But for now, we're going to start with Stephanie Joyce. Stephanie joined CCIA, the Computer and Communications Industry Association, after decades in private practice, representing technology companies and competitive carriers before state, federal, and administrative agencies and the courts. She is an experienced advocate for what she calls pro-competitive policy, including her advocacy for CCIA and at the FCC on broadband deployment in the open internet rules. So Stephanie, thank you. We look forward to hearing from you. Following Stephanie, we're going to hear from Joe Kane, who's the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at ITIF, which is the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Previously, he was a Technology Policy Fellow at the R Street Institute, where he covered spectrum policy, broadband deployment regulation, and competition and consumer protection. Before that, he was a research fellow at the Mercatus Center. Following Joe, we're going to hear from David Zumwalt, who's the CEO of WISPA, the organization now Broadband Without Boundaries. Look forward to hearing more about that branding. But David comes to WISPA from a lot of concrete hands-on experience as an engineer in working in this field. He worked as the chief operating officer of Broadband VI, a major internet service provider in the Virgin Islands, and was executive director of University of the Virgin Islands Research and Technology Park. So thank you for being with us. I believe it's your first time on Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Thank you, David. And then batting cleanup will be Baron. Baron, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Zoka. If I didn't, if I got it right, well, then I got a thumbs up. So thank you, Baron, for being with us. Baron's repeat visitor, always provides interesting and occasionally provocative insights, and are happy to have him, he is the president of Tech Freedom. Before that, he was senior fellow and director of the Center for Internet Freedom at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. So thank you for that. Let's go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie.
Good afternoon, Drew, and thank you to everyone for joining. CCIA is very pleased to participate in this panel, and CCIA was very pleased to see Chair Rosenworcel's statement yesterday, stating that she will reinstate a rulemaking about net neutrality. I don't believe that she in any way prejudiced the outcome, but certainly she made clear that her hope is that we will ensure a fair, free, and open internet. And CCIA very much supports that effort, having participated in open internet / net neutrality dockets since they started 13 years ago. I actually did that work for CCIA. I was only 12 years old at the time. I think what we're seeing in the last 36 hours is a little bit of net neutrality fatigue. I think a lot of telecom lawyers, a lot of digital services companies, certainly we know the telcos, are not pleased to return to this topic that has been so hotly debated and contested going all the way back to 1998. And I think perhaps we feel that we're living in the movie Chinatown. It's information, it's telecom, it's information, it's telecom. I think, however, what we know is that the courts are ready to affirm any reasonable FCC order explicating the need for these rules, the proper tailoring of the rules, and the FCC's return to what some old head telecomers like I believe is a pretty obvious conclusion that broadband internet access transmission is a telecommunications service. I believe that Chair Rosenworcel set out her reasoning extraordinarily clearly yesterday, explaining why the now 3 years long dearth of rules here does affect public safety and national security and privacy and rules surrounding outages. And I think she also was very clear in setting forth the regulatory restraint that she intends to employ here. She noted that in the 2015 order, the FCC forbore from 27 provisions of the 1996 Telecom Act and over 700 administrative rules. And thus, as much as those who oppose net neutrality accuse the proponents of net neutrality of being a little hysterical and alleging the sky is falling, I think perhaps that set of people are a little too dramatic as well, because the sky will not be falling. I think Chair Rosenworcel made that very clear. She's not going to make this about rate regulation. She just wants to ensure that the internet is inclusive and open and free. And we all have the right and ability in the coming months to explain our story, to explain what we hope the FCC does, and to be very clear that we are not blessing, quote, the government regulation of the internet, which is a refrain I suspect that we're going to be hearing quite a lot in the coming days. I think featuring prominently in this docket will be the notion of reasonable network management. CCIA has always supported a reasonable approach to reasonable network management, or RNM, to accommodate for the variegated subtleties in various technologies that support broadband internet access. And I think I want to echo what Chair Rosenworcel said in closing, which is, I look forward to a robust debate and to an honest explication of issues and positions. Really not looking forward to any kind of, to use the chair's word, ugliness as between the parties or ad hominem attacks. And certainly let's not have any death threats this time around. With that, I'll close my remarks. And again, thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you. Stephanie, it's great to hear your perspective, including the note of fatigue, right? I mean, here one day in and less than 24 hours in, and yet again, this is an important issue. Obviously, it's the first issue out of the gate once there's a full FCC commission. Let's continue on the order. We do know we will get Chip Pickering very soon, but let's continue with you, Joe. Tell us a little bit about your take on what's going on with what's next, to use our phrase, for net neutrality.
Sure, thanks, Drew. And I guess I'm maybe sharing the fatigue, but maybe looking at this and saying, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve now? We've not had Title II since sort of the dawn of the internet. Then we had a little blip from 2015 to 2018. And if Title II was really necessary to keep the internet free and open, where is all that blocking and throttling that was supposed to happen? We haven't really seen it. And we've seen just the opposite. It hasn't been the end of the internet. We've seen broadband has been a big success story for American infrastructure. COVID is something that should have been a nightmare for our networks. It should, a sudden 30 to 40% increase in demand would been a perfect excuse for ISPs to engage in all the stuff that we were told that we need Title II to prevent. But we didn't see that. We just saw networks getting faster and serving consumers better. We've had private ISPs investing tens of billions of dollars per year and ever increasing intermodal competition. We have fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellites now that didn't exist in 2015. So that, I think, even further undermines the case that we need Title II for anything. So yeah, I guess I just wouldn't look at the current broadband system that we have right now and say it needs a whole new regulatory regime to make it look more like your electric company. We say, I don't think that we would trust most of our public utilities to handle a 30% increase in demand all of a sudden and just handle it and keep going apace. And then there's the problem that I think Title II was designed for the telephone monopoly, and it's therefore I think it will tend to create something more like a monopoly. We can say that there's going to be forbearance, but forbearance is voluntary. The current FCC maybe might forbear from rate regulation and all the larger morass of Title II. But what about the next FCC chairman? What about the next? When we have another election and the FCC flips again. And so I would also point to BEAD. I think that's we have a really good broadband policy going on right now in this country, which is we're having the big one-time investment that we need to reach everyone in the country with internet. And BEAD, however, is facing a lot of barriers. You can take a risk here or there, but we have labor issues coming up, inflation, Buy America mandates, and I think that's all of these things are things that are going to get us very close to not succeeding in the goal that BEAD has of connecting all Americans. And so adding Title II to that and saying to all these broadband providers that we're hoping will build out to the entire country that there's going to be the risk of rate regulation and everything else in Title II coming their way is going to make it, for a lot of them, not worth it. And so we're going to get fewer people participating and people will have to wait longer to get broadband. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there for now. I think I forget what my time limit was, Drew, but I'll pass it on to the next person.
No, thank you very much. And we are so excited. Chip Pickering has joined us here. Like I said at the top, there are a couple slight little hiccups when you switch formats, and we've encountered one of them. But thank you so much for being here with us. Chip, would you like to go next, or you want to kind of go in the fifth position?
No, this is good, and thank you for your patience while we work through the technical difficulties. But it's good to be with all of you and the panel. And as we look at what the commissioner announced, Commissioner Chairwoman Rosenworcel announced yesterday and then elaborated more today, I think it's important to look back over the last 8 years and think through what have we learned, what have we seen, both in the marketplace and in the regulatory framework. In 2015, under the Wheeler Commission, a boom, an explosion of streaming and over-the-top applications, from Netflix to all of the abundant now streaming video, emerging competitive marketplace that we've seen. And why was that so important? It allowed fiber builders, new entrants that are building new networks, to unleash or unlock from the cable bundle. And it changed the economics of new fiber entrants being able to build new fiber for the incumbents, whether it's telco or cable. So that the 2015 order needs to receive the credit it's due, and that it unleashed market forces and investment and innovation, both in building and in streaming. And that's a very good thing. After 2017, we really saw that, and as many of you will notice, the marketplace is working and good, but we have learned a couple things that the Commission needs to address, whether it's national security, outages, privacy, and the examples that Chairwoman Rosenworcel used yesterday is important for a limited authority of the FCC to be able to address those. We do think that the Commission having a full slate of commissioners is a good thing, having 5. But it's also, we can say, a good thing that during the 2-2 Commission, we established a collaborative civil set of initiatives that the Commission has adopted across the board on many different areas coming out of the pandemic. And so what I'm hoping is that the dialogue, the discussion, and this rulemaking will be much more civil and collaborative than what we've had in the past. It can be a very targeted use of regulatory authority. And I believe that this Commission, very thoughtful, very deliberate, very, if you want to describe it as, they have a lot of humility. And so I think that we'll see a very thoughtful discussion among the 5 commissioners, have targeted exercise of regulatory authority. And as Joe mentioned, we can have 2 things happen at once. We can have a predictable regulatory framework, a huge infusion of private investment, and a huge infusion of public investment through the BEAD to see every American connected, and the free market, free enterprise, free expression principles of an open internet can be, just like in 2000, catalyst for new entrants and new applications and new content that will be coming over the networks. And that this is not a lose-lose, this is a win-win for the American people.
Chip, I can't resist kind of, as we reflect on this, it's, we've talked in previous Broadband Breakfast live online sessions about really the transformative moment we are in now because of investments in infrastructure. And you voiced the opinion many years ago, 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, that some of that some of that investment in broadband might ease the contentions and the problems around issues like net neutrality. I want to kind of remind you of that perspective and ask you, like, is that the case? How do we get to a more kind of sane debate around this topic now that we are in the midst of this broadband infrastructure expansion?
Yeah, this is the golden era of investment in networks, both 5G, fixed, wireless, fiber, satellite. So we are beginning to see what we've always hoped for, is an abundance of investment in networks and the competition that comes from that. And so that does solve, and that really is our objective in our policy making, and then in the investments that we hope to follow from that. There are 2 things. One thing that Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned in a forum at Axios today is that in the vacuum of no authority, we're seeing a state-by-state approach, or a patchwork of a regulatory framework on open internet and privacy and other issues. The internet was not made to be a state-by-state framework. Since the 96 Act, we wanted a national framework, and it's very important that we reestablish a national framework, whether it is on privacy or on open internet or net neutrality. I think what the Commission is doing reestablishes should be national, and they should not be state by state. I think this Commission will be very restrained in whatever they do, and be very thoughtful in what they do. And we can see where the market is today. The great thing about forbearance is it gives the FCC the ability to be as flexible as possible to examine the market as it is today and what the objectives are today. And so I think it was a wise policy that started back in 1996 that allowed forbearance. And it can be used very judiciously and very wisely today in the environment and the objectives that we have as a nation and as policymakers, but also as our companies make their investments in the building of the new networks of today and tomorrow.
Well, thanks for allowing that interjection. Let's go on back to our order. David, let's hear from you, and then Baron, and then we'll dive in with the discussions and questions that are already arriving.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Zumwalt, the President and CEO of WISPA, Broadband Without Boundaries. And just for a quick moment, Drew, to give you some background, WISPA has been around for about 20 years and started with service to the wireless ISP community, primarily in areas we now call the digital divide. But over the last few years, now we have members who have significant investments in fiber. Something like 30% of our members have significant rollouts of fiber. And if you look at what our members are doing, they're in the digital divide and they're deploying the right tool for the right job. So I come at this not from a specific technology perspective, but instead looking at the services that the ISPs that we serve are providing in their communities. As a result of COVID, which was mentioned before, we saw a dramatic increase in demand for broadband services that the ISP community responded to very, very well, and especially compared to other countries around the world. So I start by saying, I think given COVID, given the work that's been done, the investment that's been done, in spite of the fact that government programs are moving the goalposts on how we measure broadband and how we're going to fund broadband, this effort to reignite net neutrality seems to be a solution in search of a problem. Chairman Rosenworcel didn't provide details on what might be in the net neutrality notice of proposed rulemaking, so we certainly hope that it will be focused on whether any of the 2015 rules are necessary. And we certainly hope that the FCC will make a fair assessment of that record in the process that's coming. And WISPA members don't have the power, the market power, to engage in the problems that were identified that were associated with the need for net neutrality before, such as blocking, throttling, paid prioritization. So our effort's going to be about ensuring that internet governance laws and rules are going to promote transparency for consumers and edge providers without providing disproportionate burdens on the smaller providers themselves. Moving on, we want to make sure that we avoid disproportionate burdens on the smaller ISPs and would call attention to the fact that since the last effort to look at net neutrality, we've seen the development of the broadband label, which some see as a substitute for net neutrality because you're disclosing, or the ISP is disclosing, what is being provided, what service, what price, what degree of blocking, if any, is happening, and we're just not seeing it. We're also seeing increased competition, both as a result of dramatic increases in private investment, but also public investment. I think it's been mentioned before that the major questions doctrine could undercut, some of what we try to do now in terms of net neutrality. And I think if there is going to be some sort of, to Joe Pickering's point, something having to do with the treatment of state laws, that whatever the federal approach should be in a light touch way. So other than saying that I agree with much of what Chip had to say and what Joe said before, I would just emphasize that I think as we approach this, we're looking for something that's going to be reasonable and not a backwards look at problems that have long since been solved, so that we can continue to see the private market continue to respond to increases in demand for broadband services. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, David. And Baron.
I want to note how much agreement there is on this controversial issue. First of all, Stephanie is exactly right. This has been a remarkably vapid debate over the last 15 years, with people on both sides making remarkably petty and just silly arguments that are boiled down to slogans. And I'm just not interested in those. And second, there's actually a lot of policy agreement here. I was part of a working group that was convened by the Internet Society several years ago that spent the better part of 2018 working through the question of what legislation should look like. And if you want to see what a framework for legislation in this area should look like, I encourage you to go and look at that Internet Society document that lays out how Congress could, I think, fairly easily provide the clarity that everybody wants here around enforceable rules. We've seen that the Internet's survived without them. I don't think that they are necessary. The sky has not fallen, but if you think we do need enforceable rules, that's the framework that we should be enforcing here. And if we had a more functional democracy, we would already have done that. Instead, here we are arguing about the FCC. So this debate really ultimately is not a policy debate. It is in part political theater, but it's really a legal debate. And the legal question is whether the FCC has the authority to reclassify broadband as a Title II common carrier service. That question, some people think, has already been answered because the FCC issued rules in 2015, and those rules were upheld by the DC Circuit. But it's important to note that that case did not reach the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did not hear the case. In fact, the court dismissed that case because the Republican-controlled FCC had changed course. So we don't know what the Supreme Court will say about these issues, but we do know that in the last 6 years, the ground has shifted very significantly. In that time, what the two judges that dissented when the DC Circuit heard this case in 2017 said, that is that the FCC didn't have the authority to decide this major question of vast economic and political significance. That was a dissent in 2017. That's now what the Supreme Court has said repeatedly. It has in multiple cases found that there are good reasons to think that Congress did not intend for agencies to decide questions of vast economic and political significance that would significantly change the statutory scheme that they're administering, and so on and so forth. Again, that was a dissent in 2017. That's now the court's majority position. And just to see how much things have changed, you have just as one example of this, the fact that two of the top lawyers in the Obama administration, one of them being the former Solicitor General and the other being former Assistant Attorney General, I believe, just explained again that the major questions doctrine is going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the FCC to prevail when these questions are litigated. So that's the real question here. Does the FCC have the authority to decide these questions on its own? And this question is not about the light touch that the FCC might take and whether they've forborne properly. I mean, Chip essentially conceded the point here when Chip said that forbearance, which is the process by which the FCC, whittles down Title II into something smaller, Chip acknowledged that that gives the FCC a great deal of discretion. That's why the FCC can indeed forbear from most of Title II, but as long as the FCC doesn't forbear from the core of Title II, which are sections 201 and 202, those are the core sections that were imposed to govern railroads back in 1889. As long as those things are in place, the FCC, not only can they unforbear, but they can do everything that they needed to do under those other sections or might want to do under those other sections under the core provisions of common carriage regulation, which are those two core provisions of unjust and unreasonable practices. So really the question here is not whether you think the FCC has struck the right policy balance with the way that it's forborne to offer a light touch. The question is, does the agency have the authority to impose common carriage status upon companies that insist that they are not common carriers? And my view, and we can get into this if you are interested, is that common carriage status is not something that is simply imposed upon you. It is in the nature of the offering that you make on the marketplace. And the question is broadband service a common carrier service? If you parse carefully what the court said when DC Circuit heard this question, they acknowledged that you could just opt out of these rules by changing the nature of your offering. And if you were to offer something that didn't fit the definition of the FCC's order, you wouldn't be covered anyway. So just as a sidebar note here, that if you did block and throttle and you were transparent about it, you wouldn't be covered anyway. So all these rules actually do is ensure transparency, at least on their face, while also imposing this full-blown common carriage status. So I'll stop there and just note that that's the legal question that we're going to debate here. And I am extremely skeptical that the FCC has the authority to do this. I think we'd be better off focusing all the attention that's been spent on this issue on legislation and get that Internet Society framework passed so we can stop arguing about this. And if we don't, I think we'll spend the next 15 years continuing to argue about what is, in my view, the dumbest debate in tech policy.
Well, great words, dumbest debate in tech policy. Let's divide the dumbest debate into two components, the policy and the law. And I'm going to start with the policy. So on the policy, I do have to ask Stephanie and Chip and anyone else who wants to weigh in. I mean, doesn't the fact that we've been now 2.5, 4, however many years since the policy, the repeal was upheld, sort of cut against any argument of urgency? I mean, or am I missing something, right? Like, could you articulate what is the problem that needs to be solved by these rules that the FCC is putting down? I'll turn to you first, Stephanie.
The problem that needs to be solved is that we have demonstrated evidence that not only do the owners and operators of telecommunications networks have the ability to block, throttle, and engage in discriminatory behavior, they've done it. And I know they waive the documented instances of shenanigans away and say we didn't really mean it or you didn't understand the context, but nonetheless it happened in California. And the BitTorrent case was not a phantom. As our old friend Publius once wrote, if men were angels, government would not be necessary. And if we are to take the promise that was taken by several operators in 2017 to engage in net neutrality, if we are to accept the word of a representative of a trade organization that told me on a panel last May that we support net neutrality, then surely the codification of rules just to give some guardrails and just to protect consumers shouldn't be that big of a lift and shouldn't, frankly, be that frightening. I think in the debate, certainly as of 2012, we lost sight of whom the Communications Act protects: consumers. The Communications Act says the consumers get to go where they want and speak to whom they want as long as they're subscribing to your service. And that's what we're talking about here. We don't want subscribers unwittingly to be in any way disadvantaged vis-a-vis other subscribers because of whatever business plan the telecommunications operator chooses on a given day. And given that, as Barron said, we do have great agreement on a great number of things, transparency seems to be the easiest one. I don't think it goes far enough. I think that when you're talking about something as vital as broadband internet access, which this country has championed to the tune of over $150 billion in the last 10 years, we should have some guardrails just to ensure everyone knows the rules, everyone abides by the rules, and it should not be any regulatory burden to adhere to rules that you had already agreed are necessary. And I think though legislation might be a nice thing to have to perhaps refine slightly the FCC's authority, specifically with regard to IP networks, I think it's been demonstrated in the courts that the FCC doesn't need the additional instruction, and the DC Circuit has held that Congress's failure to enact more specific legislation does not negate the fact that the previous legislation is already in place, and it doesn't indicate Congress's desire to block an agency from acting in a particular way. And so I do think that something as vital as internet access, when we know that the broadband service is vital to our American life, we don't need to wait for the network to blow up. We don't want to wait for an entire consumers to suddenly be disadvantaged in their service before we act. We've already paid to fund all of this deployment because it's a public good. So let's just take the slight added measure of ensuring that discriminatory behavior is not countenanced on this service.
So Stephanie, let me just address the question. Those commitments that you're talking about, I am not aware of those being commitments to Title II. They might have been commitments to net neutrality as a principle, and maybe even under the old, was it 7? I can't remember. I've lost track of. But what was that? The prior order, the Janikowski's rule was under a different structure entirely. So could you just specifically and quickly address that point? Because I think the Title II is what gets everyone's goat up, right?
I think it does get people's goat up because they forget that the FCC did forbear and intends to forbear in the future from lots of Title II regulation. No one wants to bury anybody in red tape, but Title II is important because the DC Circuit has taught us, unless broadband internet access is categorized as telecom, no net neutrality will stand other than transparency, which is just nothing more than a consumer protection rule that frankly the FTC could have passed. And so focusing on the Title II issue gets us away from the fact that net neutrality has been discussed by the network operators. There is a pledge that was published in 2017 in the Washington Post that we support net neutrality, we want to act appropriately, and it went farther than mere transparency.
All right. Let's get some reaction.
To worry about Title II simply obscures the notion, and frankly, it's an empty promise to say we'll do net neutrality, but you can't call it Title II. Well, you know that if we don't call it Title II, we can't pass the rule.
And Drew,
Drew,
let me just
let your side go, and then we'll hear from David and then Barron. Go ahead.
Drew, what I was going to just add to Stephanie, Title II has so far been the only authority that's been upheld on net neutrality issues and principles so far. Now, Barron is correct that in this Supreme Court, under the major question doctrine, there's a lot of uncertainty. I agree with Barron that this should be done congressionally, legislatively, to give permanence, predictability, and certainty, and to keep this ping pong of regulatory policy going back and forth. But we have to act right now with what we have. Title II is the best that is legally sustainable. And although competition is emerging in many markets, and the fact that we are spending $43.5 billion in underserved markets still shows that by definition, those are still served by only one provider. So still in those markets where we're investing our public investment, that we have a lack of competition. At its core, net neutrality principles and commitments are pro-competitive. And so what we want to do is make sure that we have multiple points of in the market.
Are you still there? Faded out. Try one more time, Chip. All right, let's hear from some reactions. David and Barron, what do you make? How do you react to this?
So very quickly, I think that this is a solution in search of a problem. We have been monitoring for filings from consumer protection advocate groups. We're not seeing them complaining about an increase in blocking. This does not appear to be the problem that it might have been a few years ago. And, I would just reassert that if we're going to do something, it's got to be done with a really light touch. And Title II appears to be more than a light touch when it comes to broadband operators. In addition, I think Stephanie mentioned correctly, in my opinion, that there's been $150+ billion that's been spent on infrastructure. That's probably the government's total, but the private sector's investment far exceeds, that. So the skin in the game is very, very real across the spectrum of companies that are investing. And then final, this is just kind of an opinion piece of my own, but I believe that because of the way the goalposts keep moving in the BEAD program, we're actually going to see the unserved serve last, not first, with the BEAD program. We're going to see instead build out from edges of existing networks under the guise of this overbuilding is permitted because now these networks are considered to be underserved. So I think we're still going to have an unserved problem for a long time that it's going to be up to companies like those that WISPA supports to go solve. Thanks.
Baron, do you still want to say something, or you want to hold your topic?
Yeah, there's so much misinformation in this debate. I mean, let's just start with the baseline claim that started all of this back in 2007. This idea that Comcast was throttling BitTorrent traffic. Yes, that there was throttling of BitTorrent traffic. Why? It's precisely because Comcast was terrified of being accused by the FCC and by legislators of trying to suppress Vonage as a competitive offering, that it was trying to ensure that Vonage had quality of service on its networks. That was the original reason for what Comcast was doing. So perversely, their effort to ensure that a competitor could actually operate on their network to provide telephony over the internet ended up being turned against them. Now, I'm not defending what they did. They should have been more transparent about it. That was not a great thing. It has been misrepresented in why it happened. It hasn't happened again. We have a transparency rule on the books. And again, I'm all in favor of having legislation, but I just want to just reiterate here that this is ultimately a legal debate. And Chip and Stephanie keep saying, oh, you know, this has been upheld by the DC Circuit. Yeah, that was 6 years ago in a very different legal landscape. And the question right now, there's really only one question here. Everything else that you've heard today is a distraction. The only question that matters here is, will the Supreme Court allow the FCC to decide this question for itself? That's it.
So that's the legal question, and it may be that we can't avoid coming necessarily and only to that question, but I want to raise, and David Tate has raised in the chat and elsewhere, the technical question, and I want to ask it a different way, which is to say, is net neutrality rules going to help us eliminate the latency that we have in networks, or is it going to take us in the other direction? In other words, my question is, and David asked it in the question, presently our voice and video conferencing applications are observed to have 500 milliseconds or more of delay, even in the same city between providers. What can be done to encourage more interconnectivity across the internet? And he's pointed out that the old telephony network was microseconds, which he's clarified for all of us to hear, that's less than milliseconds. So why do we have the millisecond problem, the 500 millisecond problem? And is net neutrality going to solve or retard that problem? Whoever wants to take that question.
The technology is what it is. That's why reasonable network management has been supported by CCA for years as a way to address, again, the variegated subtleties and the relative transmission speeds that can be supported, and the atmospheric conditions under which they operate, such as in the satellites and wireless networks. I'm not sure Chair Rosenworcel would say that she wants to re-adopt net neutrality rules in order to solve latency. Latency is a technological problem that has to do with deployment and has to do with each individual company's commitment to good service. But I think what she wants to do is ensure that the latency isn't made worse by the kind of surreptitious judgment calls that telcos have made. Apparently, BitTorrent chose to favor Vonage over the gaming app. I'm not suggesting anything nefarious in that, but that choice was made, and the gaming app user wasn't aware of it. And simply telling someone in advance that their service is going to be downgraded in 12 inches of 4-point boilerplate contract language, and then giving them poor service is not a solve for what this country has demonstrated via its pocketbook to uphold, which is that everyone deserves robust, meaningful, fast, free, open, and unfettered access to broadband. And that is simply what we were trying to codify in rules. And the notion that the investment over the course of the last 20 years has been markedly at the whim, or has been meaningfully changed in response to any regulatory regime, I think has been shown to be a bugaboo that is not supported by evidence, because we've had robust network investment without the rules and with the rules. The fact that the networks were deployed in the 2015, 16, 17 timeframe that made this country capable of surviving the shutdown caused by COVID, I think demonstrates that the investment's going to happen because consumers want the investment, consumers want the service, and the money has already been spent and the BEAD program is already handing out money to continue deploying. So I don't think that net neutrality rules could be used as the scapegoat here for any kind of service latency or any kind of delay in broadband rollout. And it just strikes me that if broadband is so important in this country and we want everybody to have it, then we should have rules about the fact that it will be provided fairly.
Let's hear from David and then Joe quickly, because I want to move on to some more legal questions.
Okay, so for Dave Tate, from the circuit switch days, we used to do traffic engineering, and we would find busy hours during the day that we could use to engineer the networks for performance. And on the internet or internet use, the busy hour behavior is not the same. The utilization is not the same. So I can assure you that coming from a broadband VI perspective, where I served before WISPA, we were looking at network performance, to Stephanie's point, network management, very, very closely, because we were seeing day-to-day changes in the way that the network was being used, especially during COVID as people shifted from their workplace to home. So this is not a nefarious sort of thing that network managers are sitting there doing. They're not looking at the utilization of individual network components and saying, well, that person's using some streaming service, I'm going to throttle that. If anything, the only thing that network managers are doing is making sure that they have traffic shaping, they have capacity, they have plans in place for being able to grow that based on demand. So again, to Dave Tate's point, I think that the question about 500 millisecond delays or whatever you're seeing, that's more of a network performance issue than it is any kind of a policy issue that would ever be solved by applying the thumb of regulatory influence.
Joe, do you want to add anything to this technical piece before we come back to some of the legal questions, including preemption and et cetera?
Sure, I guess, yeah, I'm not an expert on how to fix your latency problems, but I would say I agree with Stephanie that it is about each individual company's technology, but that requires the companies paying to build out these networks that have high qualities of service. And I don't think it's a bugaboo, the Title II depressed investment. I know there were a lot of studies out there that were not that good. I don't know, I point to the one by George Ford at the Phoenix Center, I think was pretty good and showed that there was a negative impact on investment caused by Title II. And then on the BEAD point, I think it's important to point out the BEAD is voluntary. There is money going out there, but if people don't sign up to actually build the networks, then we aren't going to get the deployment.
All right. I do want to ask this question that Amy McLean has asked. Assuming the FCC approves this rulemaking, what happens with net neutrality rules or net neutrality laws that have been instituted in states, i.e. California? Who would like to take that question?
Yeah, I'll take that. The 2015 order included a strong preemption provision saying that any conflicting laws could not be enforced. So as a practical matter, it would take California's law off the board. If California's law is not the same, I'll leave it at that. So let's just say that at least it would achieve harmonization. And I think we can all agree that not having the states involved here would be a good thing. That's another reason for legislation. But it's really immaterial to the legal question of whether this rulemaking will stand up.
Other perspectives on this preemption question. This does seem to be an important one. This is where the center of gravity has moved in the last 4-6 years on this topic.
Well, the California statute that was passed in 2018. It was challenged by several of the network owners. The Ninth Circuit held that it wasn't preempted. And then the network owners abandoned the appeal and decided simply to comply with California. Today, and this is amplifying a point that Chip aptly made during his opening remarks, we do have 6 states now with net neutrality statutes of one fashion or another. And I think the way the preemption works is that states can do more, but not less. They can't create a situation where to comply with both would be impossible. And so it depends on what this order says as to whether the California statute will survive. But I know, and we all know from the privacy debates going on, it does no one any good to have a patchwork quilt of state regulations that companies have to wend and wind their way through. So the preemption question, I think we can't answer today because it depends what the order says. And I would certainly hope, like Chip, that we could have a national framework for net neutrality. And if I can give it do a free plug, also for privacy law.
Another question from an anonymous attendee: if the FCC adopts net neutrality rules, how would these rules impact NTIA's broadband programs like BEAD, but also other programs, including, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund of the FCC, the Reconnect, capital projects funds? How are these going to be impacted by these rules? Anyone want to take that? Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I don't have precise guidance on this because, BEAD is still a work in progress in many ways. But what I would say is that generally speaking, there's a recognition that if you have received money through a federal program and you have an enforceable commitment, that can create not a preemption, but create an inability for more federal money from a different program to flow into that particular purpose. But the overall issue here is that anytime you move the goalposts, then you invite basically more than feedback, but some sort of appeal process from people who are operating under one set of rules that are now changing. Now, it may sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my face because I just said that the broadband operators are already doing, what people were scared enough to, pursue net neutrality before. They're already fixing all of that. But at the same time, any change that's going to be coming from the FCC, on this is going to have to be refactored into the way companies are building out their networks. And remember, a lot of the sort of explosion in digital divide investment, not just from WISPA members, but others who are out there, happened without any kind of Title II regulatory, action. So I don't see it as being, necessary to continue to move us forward.
I want to come back to Baron's core question, which is, has the legal landscape changed, namely through Supreme Court appointments since 2017, 2019? In other words, is this an issue that is going to be upheld? And I'd be interested in other people's reactions, or Baron, you want to elaborate on too. But let's hear from Stephanie and Chip on, do you think that is the only issue in play? And if so, is your case as strong as it was 4 years ago?
I think it is. And I have read the paper that Mr. Verrilli and Gershengorn released about the major questions doctrine. And I'm having trouble seeing the major questions doctrine as applicable now, because reviewing the West Virginia v. EPA case, which is the one in which the Supreme Court returned its focus to this doctrine, the court emphasized in several places that what they were reviewing from the EPA was something unprecedented, something the EPA had never done before. And yes, it was a major shift in regulation, but that newness and the unprecedented nature of the EPA's action was really what caused them to say, we need to really focus on whether Congress ever meant you to do this. You've never done this before. We're dealing with an issue that has been at the forefront of telecom policy since 1998, when DSL was categorized as telecom. So I'm not sure major doctrine is going to carry the day here. And in terms of what the Supreme Court will do, I think they're going to defer to the FCC again. And they might also, express some fatigue because they dealt with this in Brand X, and they probably watched this go through the DC circuit 5 different times on 5 different orders. But I'm not sure major doctrines would extinguish anything the FCC does here. But I will say we are on the precipice of, for someone who's done telecom for as long as I have, is breaking my brain, which is we have people who want to say that broadband internet access is not common carriage, not telecom, but Twitter is. And so Twitter should be regulated as the common carrier, but Verizon Fiber should not. And I'm not sure what will happen to my life after that. It just, again, it breaks my brain. So we do have some, it's the conflation of info versus telecom, the MFJ dichotomy that was created that I think is being maybe misunderstood or stretched beyond limits that it can support. I'm not worried that the Supreme Court will slap the FCC down if they re-adopt the rules that they adopted in 2015.
Let's give everyone a chance to offer a final word. Baron, I know you want to say something, so go first, and then we'll hear the.
Yeah, strong agree with Stephanie at the lunacy of certain people who might happen to be sitting commissioners at the FCC, insisting that it's terrible overreach for the FCC to treat broadband as a common carrier, but of course they could do that to Twitter or Facebook or whatever. I mean, that is just another demonstration of how completely unserious so many people are in this debate. So I disassociate myself completely from those people. And I also don't think this is a slam dunk issue. I mean, part of the challenge here is this is a very murky area of doctrine. The Supreme Court is still working this through. Stephanie correctly described one of the flavors of the major questions doctrine, but it's not the only flavor. The court has in fact recognized that there are multiple situations, what it calls extraordinary cases, in which it's not reasonable to assume that Congress intended for an agency to decide a question. One of those is the circumstance that Stephanie described. There are other circumstances. Questions of vast economic and political significance is one of them. Yet another is a situation in which the agency, as in the earlier case involving Utility Air Regulatory Group, feels the need to tailor and modernize and rework statute. I think on both of those scores, that's very much what the FCC is doing here. I don't think this is easy, but we could spend hours discussing this issue. And will just conclude by saying I am relatively confident, but not absolutely, that we're going to have the same conversation after the Supreme Court has struck down what the FCC does. And you'll all be wishing that we'd spent those years focused on legislation instead of wasting them yet again, watching these things work their way through the courts.
All right, let's hear final thoughts from Joe, David, Stephanie, and Chip.
Yes, I'd finally just say, as Stephanie was saying, we do support net neutrality, and it shouldn't be a big lift to codify the core principles that we all agree on. But you can't do that with Title II, because Title II is a big law that contains a lot of other things. 72, we don't want to do rate regulation. So then why would we want Title II? Why not write it into legislation? If we don't want to take ISPs at their word, and that's fine with me, I don't really trust my ISP either. Why should we then take the FCC at their word about forbearance going into the future? In fact, the fact that you have to forbear so much to make this work shows how much of a mismatch this statute is for regulating the internet. And I think that's also going to play into the legal question of major questions doctrine of whether this statute is the kind of statute you can use to impose these kind of regulations. And then finally, I just point to the chairwoman yesterday said, these rules are so important because the internet is essential. And I agree that the internet is really essential, but that means that we should be leaning into the success of the internet in the last 5 years and not be adding a morass of new regulations on top of it.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us, Joe. David.
I would just remind people that we've been looking to see if this is really a problem, especially compared to where it was a few years ago. I recognize that we finally have a tiebreaker in the FCC on the commission, and so it's natural these come up again. But what I hope that we look at now is look at how much progress has been made. We have the broadband label. We don't have this problem to the degree people thought it existed in the past. And we want to protect the interests of especially the smaller operators who are out there serving their communities and don't need yet another layer of regulation foisted upon them at a time when they're the ones who are making significant investments in closing the digital divide. Thanks.
Stephanie.
As some wise men from London once sang, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, you get what you need. And it would be lovely to get a very specific statute as an addendum, if you will, to the 96 Act that expressly sets forth what can be done with IP networks and the fact that internet access is a telecom service and this is what the FCC can do. But, the government's about to shut down in about 96 hours. So it'd be lovely, it'd be nice to have, but I think we have to love the one we're with, and that's Section 202. And I look forward to a really good debate. And I think this issue of forbearance, the FCC is bound by the APA to give very careful consideration to everything that's set forth in the record. And if the record bears out that the following 8 million regulations in Part 64 and 66 have to be forborne for, then they will. But simply to add to the transparency rule by saying no blocking or throttling or discriminatory behavior of that nature is not an avalanche of regulation. It is very closely tailored. And I do believe that is what Chair Rosenworcel intends to accomplish in this proceeding. I've so enjoyed seeing you gentlemen. And the one benefit that I'm going to see in the reopening of this issue, again, is that I get to spend time with excellent people like you. And I'm very pleased to have been here. Thank you, Drew.
Thank you. Well, Chip, we'll give you the last word on this important topic.
Well, thank you. And it's great to follow Stephanie and everyone else. The good news is the sky is not falling. investment and innovation, both public and private, is going to continue to flow. The commission and the chairwoman will take the right light touch approach that's targeted to the issues of today, not of the past. And so, although there'll be thunder and noise, I think that the reality is that we'll see the continuation of right touch, light touch policy. The investment flows will continue, and BEAD and private investment will give us an opportunity to connect every American. Competition will spread as a result, but these are, again, guiding principles that I think everyone agrees with, and we will not go over the cliff into to bad regulatory overreach. One day, maybe, Baron, we can have a congressional action that we can all celebrate. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Drew.
Well, thank you, each of you, for being with us. I'm just popping in the chat window. Next week, we'll be talking about permitting reforms and pole attachments. And then the week following, we'll be talking about will the Affordable Connectivity Program be renewed? On behalf of our great panel, Chip Pickering, Stephanie Joyce, Joe Kane, David Zumwalt, and Baron Zoka, I'm Drew Clark, and we'll see you next week.